In our third scene, we see an interesting reversal. She sees her dad sleeping on the couch and attempts to leave by going out the window. Notice how the colors have now been reversed since the first scene at home. Gwen is now represented with warm colors, and George is represented by the cooler colors. We can tell that Gwen is embracing her responsibility and duty, and her dad is now struggling with isolation and his sense of purpose. Gwen talks about how her dad is a good cop because he puts on the badge so someone else doesn't have to. She tells him that her mask is her badge. As they talk, his background remains teal and she remains orange. There is a cool reverse shot where Gwen talks about how she was trying to do things her dad's way, but it wasn't working. The shot is from underneath their glass table and it sort of double reverses the colors on us. Her background is green now, but her body remains orange colored. This is a cool mix match and gives us important information as she throws the mask down in frustration. Then we get what I would consider one of the most important backgrounds in the film. This background's color palette shifts as time goes on. At the beginning of the shot, the colors start off as a mixture of pinks and baby blues, but as Gwen goes on explaining, the colors become more vibrant and saturated and end up as a mixture of magenta, purple, and orange. So why is this background so important? Well, it's when Gwen finally tells her dad about her struggles, about how she's unable to help those she loves most. Because they can only know half of who she is, that means she's completely on her own. She doesn't know where to go or what to do, and she doesn't want to lose anyone else. I think there are two interpretations you can draw from this background. The first has to do with Gwen's perspective. She starts off unsure, but ends up with a sort of positive affirmation through a negative statement. I can't lose one more friend. That tension, with a clever bit of writing, is exactly what is being mirrored in the background that we see. I would say that this is the moment that she comes into her own and fully embraces her identity as Spider-Gwen. The second potential meaning is from her dad's perspective. It simply signifies how he sees his daughter growing up right before his eyes. He can see that his daughter is making her way and figuring things out for herself, even if it's not the path that he would have chosen. The background growing in vibrancy and saturation could be a depiction of Gwen coming into her own as his daughter, not necessarily Spider-Gwen. Her dad says that he always told her to do it by the book. Back to the familiar colors, but notice how the frame is split 50-50 with warm and cool colors. As we mentioned earlier, this tells us that George is conflicted in equal parts now. Then there's a shot with both of them, still split in half, as he says, I took an oath. This is the climax of this entire conversation, and it's what initially sent Gwen off on her adventure into another dimension. She challenges her father by saying, then arrest me, Dad, and holds up her hands for him to put handcuffs on. The shot then cuts to a different kind of 50-50. It's a profile shot of both characters facing each other, with George on the left and Gwen on the right. The background contains a mix of warm and cool colors, but the interesting thing here is that this is almost the exact same color palette that we saw in the first scene when Gwen hugs her dad, although it's a little less vibrant.